This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the thumb was engineered, the foot was deviled, and the Peter was black, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder what a basket chair is? Or why Watson's medicine of choice is always brandy? Or what a coal scuttle is and why cigars would be there?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 418, The Origin of 221B Worship. Hello, and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, you are an original, I must say.
I thought you were going to say you're a minute.
No, not yet.
That's very true. But I have to tell you, Scott, this is the first show that we're doing in 2025.
Wow, season
and I
9.
I don't know about you, but I am really excited. I got my flying car this morning.
Really? I'm on my way to Mars, so I can't hear you.
Well, give Elon my love. And while you're on your way there, do me a favor. See if you could find my flying car. It was a convertible.
Oh.
It was here a minute ago.
Wait, you're based in New Jersey, aren't you?
Yeah, it should be over
It was
Michigan.
being delivered by drone. I don't know if you had spotted those.
Oh, I knew I was hiding under my desk for some reason. Thank you.
There you go.
Very much.
Well, thank you for that. And welcome to 2025. Welcome to season 9. This is now going into our 9th season of doing Trifles. It's amazing to think that we've got more than 400 episodes behind us and many more in front of us to come. As is our custom, at the beginning of the season, we announce which kind of series we are doing. We do recurring series every season. We are bringing back what we've done for the third week of every month, something called Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist, where we look at a piece of Sherlockian scholarship. We're adding to that this year by looking at Morley-Montgomery Award-winning articles. These are the top articles of the year from the Baker Street Journal, and we will be doing that on the first week of every month. And we are kicking it off with The Origin of 221B Worship, which was the 1961 winner of the Morley-Montgomery Award. We'll get into that in just a moment, but we wanted to remind you that you can support the show either on Patreon or Substack, whichever way works for you. Recurring monthly charges there for as little as $1 a month. That shows your support of the show. All of our supporters are automatically entered for a drawing to get a back issue of the Baker Street Journal at the end of every month. And we actually have a new set of bonus content that we'll be sharing with you, in addition to other stuff that comes to us. But we will have a series called Trifling Trifles, topics that are perhaps too short to squeeze into one of our episodes, but we thought were still worth considering. So be on the lookout for Trifling Trifles just for our supporting members. You can find all of this and more in the show notes on whichever app you listen to, or at our website, SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Well, let's jump into this. Just a little background on the Morley-Montgomery Award. It's named after Christopher Morley, the founder of the Baker Street Irregulars, about whom you will hear more in just a moment, and James Montgomery, who was one of the Baker Street Irregulars, I think, most prolific correspondents or scholars in the 40s and 50s. He produced a series of Christmas annuals, which ended up spawning the Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual. And the award was established in 1958 from the legendary bookseller Lou D. Feldman. And it consisted of $100 donated by Feldman until his death in 1976. The Morley-Montgomery Award was suspended in 1980 and was not resurrected until 1995 and is still extant. And the reason we are covering this may seem a little odd for the first version of our Morley-Montgomery Award winning episodes. The topic is the origin of the Baker Street Irregulars. And while this isn't necessarily something that is germane specifically to the canon, it's important because we as Sherlockians have continued the tradition that was established by Christopher Morley and the Baker Street Irregulars. That's why we're doing this podcast. It's because there's a whole community of Sherlock Holmes fans out there who belong to these groups, and the Baker Street Irregulars kind of serves as the first one that sprung up. And we thought, looking at Robert Keith Leavitt's article, The Origin of 221B Worship, some notes on the conception, gestation, parturition, and legitimization of the Baker Street Irregulars would be entirely appropriate. This first episode of Season 9, this first week of January, this first day of January.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. And I have to tell you that over the holiday, I was up in Boston, and one of our listeners, Bill Tsingos, made a point of telling me how much he appreciated this, because without these kinds of discussions, he really wouldn't be aware of some of these old writers. And, usually he says he's sparked to, go out and find a copy of a book or read more. And that's great. That's just what we want to do.
It is indeed. So why don't we jump into it? This is, as I said, by Robert Keith Leavitt. This originally appeared over 2 issues of the Baker Street Journal. We're not going to take you through both. We'll just stick mostly to part 1. In 1961, Robert Keith Leavitt was an old friend of Christopher Morley and an old irregular, and he gives, what he does is he sets down the history of the Baker Street Irregulars, something that had only been done as kind of an oral history until then. So he codifies it for irregulars of the time, and we still have it to this day. And this kind of marks the end of Christopher Morley and Edgar Smith's reign over the Baker Street Irregulars. They died in 1957 and 1960. And this entered into the years when Julian Wolfe headed the organization. I think you'll hear a lot of themes here that are similar, certainly for anyone who's attended a Sherlockian society event, whether it's local or national, at the Baker Street Irregulars level. You'll recognize some of the names, you'll recognize some of the traditions, and understand how we got our start.
Yeah. Oh, and the only thing I wanted to add about the Morley-Montgomery Award, and this is mentioned sort of in the intro to this by Stephen Rothman, there was a judging, and the couple of people would get together to assist the editor in selecting the award winner, and this was selected by none other than Bill Baring-Gould, Basil Davenport, and Rex Stout. So. And as you say, Edgar had passed in 1960. And so Robert Keith Leavitt begins by saying, look, before Edgar Smith passed away, he asked me to gather and collate the available records and recollections of me and other people who were around when all of this started. And so I'm going to do this, he says, in 2 installments. But first, I'm going to try to figure out how we got to the Baker Street Irregulars, and then explain some of the peculiar things about the society, including its constitution and its bylaws and so on and so forth. So he says, the BSI had a father society, a mother society, and an uncle godfather society. And all contributed in some measure to the peculiar nature of the Baker Street Irregulars. All of these groups had been sired by Christopher Morley. And in the early days when Prohibition was still active in the United States, this was really connected to his loves and to his enthusiasms and his habit of forming clubs on the spur of a moment. And anything might stimulate him to form a club. The title of a book that he found in a secondhand bookstore, and some chance phrases that he heard. Well, many of his clubs met once and never again, but 3 of them at least lasted. And the first of these was the 3 Hours for Lunch Club, which had its roots down in Morley's early newspaper days in downtown New York. And basically, it included everybody that Morley liked well enough to ask repeatedly for lunch. And this turned out to be scores of people, because Morley was hugely gregarious. And, sometimes as he changed office and he took different jobs, the community would change. But there was a hard core of Morley companions that furnished the majority of attendance at any one time. And these people were the literary figures of the era, the people from the worlds of book publishing and book selling and book collecting and seafaring authors and Anglophile Americans, painters and sculptors and actors and people from the theater, all people that Morley felt were kindred spirits, or as he liked to say, kinsprits.
And, it's worth pausing here on some of the adjectives that Leavitt uses to describe Christopher Morley, because I think getting a sense of Morley's personality gives you a sense as to what he enjoyed, who he enjoyed, why he brought these people together. He said, Chris of the high heart, the richly storied intellect, the prodigious imagination, the boundless curiosity, the irrepressible spirit, the elfin prankishness, the selfless generosity, the splendid shining soul. Christopher Morley during the pre-repeal era, that's during Prohibition, was in his pre-Elizabethan or unbearded stage. In his early 40s, he was stout, lustily active, gregarious, busy, prosperous, and immensely popular. He rarely lunched with fewer than 4 people, and most often as not, as you said before, with a group of a dozen or more. So, what a fine person. That sounds like somebody I would like to hang around with, and somebody I would hope who found me interesting enough to invite back after one meal.
Very, very Falstaffian, isn't it, that description of Morley? Well, the second group after the 3 Hours for Lunch Club was the Grillparzer Sittenpolizeiverein. And bear in mind, too, that Morley was a Rhodes Scholar who traveled in Europe while he was at Oxford University, and also spoke German. So the Grillparzer Sittenpolizeiverein is really the Grillparzer morals police, and Sittenpolizeiverein. And Grillparzer relates to Franz Grillparzer. And of course, as Leavitt has just told us, Morley would pick up a book occasionally, and it would stimulate him. Well, he picked up a copy of the collected plays of Franz Grillparzer for 35 cents, apparently, at the bookshop on his way to lunch. And this occurred that he would have the Grillparzer morals police. And the idea here is that this would be a co-educational version, a co-ed version. Women would actually come. Now, the 3 Hours for Lunch Club is basically a bunch of newspapermen and writers and actors and other people who are smoking and drinking in the kitchen of Christ Sella's, several times at least, many times, Christ Sella's restaurant, about 15 or 20 people that used to meet early in the 1930s, and it was a modest-priced speakeasy, says Leavitt, and had a big back room, and they ate often on Saturdays around one big oval table. Well, that might not be, in the 1930s, the right place for a lady. But in any case, that was the fact. So he also formed this other group, and Morley would bring along not only anyone who happened to be in his office at the moment, but as many as possible of the female employees of the Saturday Review. And these people Morley called collectively the mermaids, largely because these early meetings of the Grillparzer group were held in a speakeasy on which the walls were stenciled with underwater scenes and which was known as the Goldfish Bowl. And later meetings were often held again in Chris Sella's back room, but at least one important meeting here was held elsewhere. And then Leavitt goes on to tell us a little bit about Grillparzer, who was really from the late 18th, early 19th century, an Austrian dramatist. And there's a ritual here when you join the Grillparzer Sittenpolizeiverein, which some of us have brought to the 3 Hours for Lunch Club. You would open this book, this collected book of plays by Franz Grillparzer, which were translated into English. So it's not in German. And new members would open the book and pick out from whatever line they happen to see on the page a phrase or a clause or a passage or a collection of words. And they would underline it as finding it more or less appropriate to something that was happening right at that instant. And below it, they would sign their name and anything that could work as a seal. In the old days, you could get a package of cigarettes with a label on it that showed it had been processed by the local authority regulating the sale of cigarettes. Well, they'd take off the little paper seal from the package of Camels or Chesterfields or whatever it was and lick the back of it and stick it on the page underneath the signature. And that made it official because Chris, who was the grand master of the Verein, would attest. He'd stand up and attest in stately formality that, Joe Schlabotnik here is now a member of the Grillparzer Sittenpolizeiverein, and here's why. And this book, this original volume, had been, in the hands of Bill Hall and still exists today.
A wonderful tradition, and that leads us to the third most significant of Morley's clubs, the Foundry, which was essentially the same as the 3 Hours for Lunch Club, had the same central core, but it was designed to support Morley's Hoboken theatrical venture when he was kind of struggling with it. Morley started a theatrical company in Hoboken, New Jersey. It was a difficult time. This was during the Depression, and it was not a financial success, let's just say. And he gathered these people together to, again, lunch and learn. And unlike his other clubs, this one had more of a formal membership list, and it met only on mail call, meaning that there would be mailed invitations or announcements. It was usually for dinner, always in the evening. And from it, the Foundry, the BSI inherited some of these traits, the membership list, the invitations, etc. So these are the sources for the Baker Street Irregulars. And Leavitt already apologizes for the intolerable length of the recounting. But again, remind yourselves, this is around 1930. There was a confluence of events. Conan Doyle passed away. And we, of course, have the double-day publication of the complete Sherlock Holmes stories. And it was the memorial edition with an introduction by Christopher Morley. He'd been an ardent Conan Doyle fan all of his life, and this was entirely appropriate for this leading bookman of the day to write the introduction. So these things fanned anew a fire that had never died, the glow of interest in the Sherlock Holmes stories and in the Holmes legend or saga as something transcending the mere published stories and obviously constituting for a really intelligent person revealed truth. Capital R, capital T. Many people, including our own Vincent Sterrett, had been writing occasional pieces along the lines of this faith for a generation. So it suddenly becomes codified. And then in 1931, you've got S.C. Roberts, Dr. Watson, T.S. Blakeney's Sherlock Holmes Fact or Fiction in 1932, and H.W. Bell's Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson in 1932 as well. So following on the heels of that in 1933 comes Sterrett's The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. So some major publications that are all leading to this Sherlockian scholarship, this writings about the writings that was in vogue even directly following Conan Doyle's passing.
Yeah, now that's a good point to underscore. I mean, bear in mind that what we've been talking about at great length, unfortunately, up until now, but this is a really interesting essay, had nothing to do with Sherlock Holmes. It had to do with Chris Morley and his enthusiasms, his lunching with newspaper men and other people, his evening gatherings with women that were female employees included from the staff of the Saturday Evening Review. It's just really, it's all social. But now Conan Doyle is gone, and it sort of kicks things off. And then in 1932 or early in 1933, what really happened here was, the fact that it's the end of Prohibition. And at the end of Prohibition, speakeasies were feeling competitive about attracting people. It used to be easy to get people into a speakeasy, but now, they've got more choice, and Prohibition is on the way out. And so there was a custom that came up, which is buying a round of drinks. You ask a challenge question, and a round of drinks is at stake. Boy, Dave, if you can't answer this question. So this is sort of the early trivia. And it could be about a variety of things. But Morley was a great fan. Doyle had died, and the sacred writings, the cases of Sherlock Holmes, the 60 cases. And that was a subject for the challenge. Who was Mrs. Turner? And what did the dog do in the nighttime? Well, what happened with this kind of custom was many more people began studying the cases of Sherlock Holmes carefully because they wanted to find the real hard questions. What color were Vincent Spaulding's collar buttons and things, and things like that. And, many people began to search out different themes that ran in through the stories. Like Holmes' techniques of deduction. And then Morley himself was trying to do the same thing, but beat everybody else. And so that became the custom of drinking toasts. And, if somebody had failed to identify, if somebody was asked who was the second most dangerous man in London, and they couldn't say, oh, that was Colonel Sebastian Moran. Well, then they should buy a round of drinks and everybody should toast the second most dangerous man in London. And some of these toasts became rituals.
Yeah, it's a wonderful tradition. It's something that was part of the culture of the time, and you simply put the layer of Sherlock Holmes over it, and it becomes possible. And we get into, as I say, 1933, Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. Elmer Davis reviewed it in the Saturday Review of Literature in December of 1933. It paid tribute to Sterrett's great work of scholarship, but also went to a length to comment on none other than the love life of Sherlock Holmes. And Davis wrote, "These are all matters that deserve the serious attention of scholars and will undoubtedly receive it." Often thereafter, the column The Bowling Green carried letters from people like Felix Morley commenting on points of Sherlockian lore, and it was becoming evident to the world that a society of Holmesians, or Holmesians, was needed. And on January 6th, 1934, the world got it, though without its realizing that a birth had actually taken place. So this was the evening when the Baker Street Irregulars first met. And it occurred at the Hotel Duane, which was on Madison Avenue between 36th and 37th Streets. Just that fall of 1933, the management of the hotel wanted to create a little stir, make the hotel a gathering place for the publishing and bookselling industries. So they took a lounge below stairs, and they redecorated it and plugged it as a luncheon and meeting place for publishers. And they would, of course, have contacted people like Christopher Morley to go ahead and use it. So Chris sits down to write his Bowling Green column for the first issue of the Saturday Review. It was scheduled to come out in 1934. And look at the date. It was January 6th. Wonderful. Sherlock Holmes' birthday, as Chris had long been contending. And on a Saturday, well, there really ought to be a party. And so, with Duane's publicity fresh in his mind, Chris wrote a couple of pieces for the Bowling Green, and it's kind of a call and response. He conjured up a question that came in from a reader, and then answered it himself. So the letter comes in last year. On what evidence I cannot guess, you announced that January 6th was the date of Sherlock Holmes' birthday. It seemed about right. Anyhow, every year about Christmas time, I get my Conan Doyles and read Sherlock Holmes again. Your comment about cocktails having gone back to 25 cents reminded me that Holmes considered even that price a trifle high. And the noble bachelor, he looked at the hotel bill. Cocktails cost a shilling and a glass of sherry, 8 pence. He deduced that the bill was from an expensive hotel. Well, will not the Hotel Duane on Madison Avenue invent a Sherlock Holmes cocktail in honor of his birthday? Another thought. What evidence can you give of Sherlock's religious feelings, if any? Signed, Charing Cross, St. George, Staten Island. Well, Morley answers that he likes the suggestion of a cocktail, would be pleased to share his judgment, and then remarks about Holmes's religious feelings, saying he's probably scared off of church after getting bitten on his way to chapel when he was in college. So anyway, that was the germ, the seed of an idea for a birthday party for Sherlock Holmes, probably concocted with Duane and with Doubleday. The publishers, of course, wanted to boost sales. So this would have been a perfect opportunity to publicize that birthday, having a man of the press, having bookish people gather in a hotel that was looking for bookish people.
Well, sadly, too, Leavitt tells us that he has not been able to construct a good detailed list of who was there. He makes some assumptions. He remembers, of course, being there. Bill Hall was there, Frank Henry, Mitchell Kennerly, and maybe there were some Doubleday salespeople there. And someone else who was there tells me, Hutchinson or Hutchins or Gene Hutchins or somebody like that. Well, anyway, he says somebody actually brought a camera and taken pictures with a flash. But nobody has been able to find him or those pictures. Now, boy, isn't that sad. And interestingly enough, Robert Keith Leavitt here says, as the birth of a newborn society, it really wasn't very noticeable. Morley spoke of it being Holmes's birthday and proposed toasts, but I don't remember, and none of the other people I've talked to who were there remember. any announcement that this was a meeting of some society devoted to Sherlock Holmes. I remembered this as a more festive, maybe, meeting of the Grillparzer group. But when I gather all the paperwork together and I look at all the memories, it does become clear to me that Morley at least regarded this as the first meeting of, okay, the Baker Street Irregulars. Now, it may have been only a dim idea, but within 2 weeks afterwards, it had firmly fixed itself in his mind, and he was talking about the Baker Street Irregulars in print. And the date, of the second annual meeting, so termed by Chris on that is significant because it was held on January 6th, 1936, even though the day was a Monday. And, that date sort of persisted because Morley had long thought it to be, of course, Sherlock Holmes's birthday.
I like the idea, too, as Leavitt describes, of a fun activity. After lunch, we played sardines with the pretty ladies who were there as our guests. As you may know, it's sort of hide and seek in reverse. The person who is it steals away and hides. Others look for him or her, and when they find him, they crawl into the same hiding space. And so for each additional finder, as they accumulate, at length you can see the hiders now being sought by only one or two questers get very sardine compressed and correspondingly happy. And this is the game that everybody remembers that day at the Duane. So, and in the Bowling Green a few weeks later, it was kind of accounted. William Hall, WSH, secretary of the Baker Street Irregulars, has allowed us to look over the minutes of the first meeting of the club. And this is interesting because Morley called it a club for the first time. Among other business, it appears the matter of the official toast was discussed. The health must always be first drunk to the woman. Suggestions for succeeding sentiments, which will have their own overtones, and for all genuine Sherlockians, were to Mrs. Hudson, Mycroft, the second Mrs. Watson, the game is afoot, and the second most dangerous man in London. So right there, we kind of have the order of toasts, which still happens to this day. And you'll see this happen at Sherlockian societies all around the world, where toasts are drunk, and largely to many of those same individuals' phrases or concepts.
Well, it's lovely how these traditions have continued and evolved over the years. In particular, the one involving that aspect of the very first meeting here, the formal meeting. And I refer, of course, to the practice of sardines, of squishing a large number of people into a small space. And, of course, in my earlier memories of the Baker Street Irregulars, we met in the Regency Hotel, and how it had grown from a small group of 20 people to a number that far exceeded the available space in the Regency Hotel, which led to long queues on the way to the restroom and great crowds at the bar and people sitting shoulder to shoulder in tight quarters at tables. But that's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
What a very amiable person.